President Lee Jae Myung and Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. sit down for their summit in Manila on this Tuesday. We have more in Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Tuesday, March 3rd here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. South Korea and the Philippines are sitting down for their summit today in Manila. For more on this event and bilateral ties, I have Stephen with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio. Stephen, as always, welcome back.
Nice to be here, thanks.
I also have Jean with the daily The Philippine Star joining this session virtually from Manila. Jean, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Lovely. Stephen, we shall start here in the studio. Now, less than an hour ago, I believe the leaders of South Korea and the Philippines met yet again, following their first meeting, of course, here in South Korea on the margins of the APEC summit. Let's start with what has been shared about their second encounter.
Well, we don't know much about the actual contents of that they'll be exchanging, but we saw a pretty picturesque seeming welcome ceremony. It looked like a glorious sunny day in Manila. And the presidential palace in the capital looked like a pretty idyllic setting. Anyone who's been to Manila can tell you it's a pretty busy, kind of gritty city, but you'd never know that just looking at the images from inside the presidential compound. President Lee was accompanied by First Lady Kim Young and some of his senior advisors, you could see in the background there. And he greeted Marcos and the Philippine First Lady. And, as tends to be the case at these kinds of gatherings, everybody was all smiles and looked to be set to get off to a cordial and cooperative gathering.
Right, for some substantial talks, of course. Jean, in fact, what are some of the important items on the summit agenda for the two leaders today?
I believe that as we speak, they're about to conclude their bilateral meeting. So, like Stephen said, we don't have as many details as we would like to have. But many of these agreements will likely include deals on security, trade, agriculture, and more, based on the secretaries that are present in the meeting. And later tonight, there'll be a state banquet, which is also traditional for the state visits. So tomorrow, both President Lee and President Marcos will attend the Philippines-Korea Business Forum, and the forum is hoping to advance around $20 billion in bilateral trade by the year 2030. So the forum will act as a channel to grow bilateral partnerships across several key areas, including manufacturing, energy, and among other sectors.
All right. Jean, what has been the focus of the media coverage there with regard to President Lee Jae Myung's visit to the Philippines?
Much of the media excitement here in the Philippines surrounding President Lee's visit has focused on the potential areas of economic cooperation between South Korea and the Philippines. So not only is this President Lee's first visit to the country since assuming power, it's his first visit to the Philippines since the free trade agreement between Manila and Seoul took effect. So now some of the media outlets have pondered if there are other areas of economic cooperation between the Philippines and South Korea, other than building upon that free trade agreement. Some analysts have said that the Philippines should use this as an opportunity to become South Korea's gateway into Southeast Asia, especially since Manila is the 2026 chair for the ASEAN Summit. A few media outlets have called this a strategic alignment between the Philippines and South Korea. One pointed out that Manila can take a cue from Seoul on how to transform from an agrarian country into a tech powerhouse. Another major point of media coverage is definitely the potential deepening of defense ties. Talks of defense and maritime cooperation are on the table, I believe. This is of great interest to us as Filipinos due to the ongoing territorial role with China over the West Philippine Sea and South China Sea. There's also an active effort on the Philippines' end to modernize its military and improve its defense posture.
Right. Stephen, as I mentioned earlier, this latest encounter between the two leaders is their second summit following their first here in South Korea on the sidelines of the APEC summit in Gyeongju. Could you briefly remind us about their first face-to-face last year here in South Korea?
Well, that took place on the sidelines of the APEC gathering in the southern city of Gyeongju. And that was, anyone who remembers that week, as I certainly do, that was a real kind of whirlwind time. That was when the leaders of, I think, all the participating countries had like a number of meetings scheduled throughout the day, and it was a kind of hectic time. So that was the first face-to-face meeting between Lee and Marcos. So I think that was just a kind of a tone-setting, ice-breaking, handshaking kind of ceremony. And I think in that gathering, reading the press coverage that came out of it and reading the comments from Lee's office, the two leaders touched on the country's shared history. The Philippines was one of the first countries that sent troops to fight on the South Side during the Korean War. And ever since then, the countries have had a very kind of close ties. A lot of South Koreans are retired in the Philippines, and a lot of, if you go to certain tourist areas of the Philippines, as I have, you will hear Korean almost as much as you will hear Tagalog or English, if not more. And there's just, I think, a fair bit of mutual complementarity between the economies. A lot of the produce and a lot of different other things that you find in South Korean supermarkets is imported from the Philippines. And one question that I always think of when it comes to the Philippine economy, there's a lot of potential there, but one thing that has kind of held the country back is a kind of weak or unreliable infrastructure. And so when the two countries engage with each other, I'm always kind of rooting for more cooperation in that area. I think it would make sense for there to be more South Korean companies building bridges and building ports and building water systems and helping with more reliable electrification in some maybe rural parts of the Philippines. So I don't know if at the gathering in Gyeongju they really had the time to get into the more kind of detailed questions of that nature. So I think it makes sense that now that Lee has had a bit more time to get his footing on the foreign policy front, that he's now back in the Philippines and he's able to have a kind of deeper engagement with Marcos and to explore some of these areas of cooperation.
Right, cooperation, the civilian infrastructure front then. Jean, I wonder, keeping in mind the latest geopolitical events, what do you suppose are the expectations within the Philippines with regard to its exchanges with South Korea?
I believe it boils down to two major areas of interest, which would be to deepen defense ties and trade ties. So, in terms of defense, the U.S. has a mutual defense treaty with both the Philippines and South Korea. Unfortunately, recent decisions made by the Trump administration have casted doubt on whether or not it can be a dependable ally. The Philippines is still a U.S. ally, but the Marcos administration has also expressed keen interest in diversifying and deepening ties with more countries. South Korea is already one of the top arms provider to the Philippines as well. The chief of the armed forces of the Philippines has also expressed hopes for a visiting forces agreement between Manila and Seoul soon. So this visit from President Lee might actually expedite discussions. I do believe the topic of the West Philippine Sea and the South China Sea will be tackled by the two presidents, since defense and maritime cooperation are part of the agenda of the bilateral meeting. Now, in terms of trade, again, I believe that recent uncertainties faced by the Trump administration has left the Philippines needing to deepen economic ties to make it more resistant to shocks. So the US did slap a tariff on the Philippines, which came as a surprise since we are ally countries. I believe that South Korea has also imposed a tariff. So while there has been intervention on this front, I think it's best for the Philippines to be forward-looking and to establish deeper trust with countries within the region.
Right. Beyond Mr. Trump's tariffs then, Stephen, his military mission, if you will, especially that in the Middle East right now, has some observers claiming that middle power diplomacy could actually serve to restore some sense of stability. That being said, do you suppose South Korea and the Philippines can work together to achieve this purpose?
I don't see why not. I would just say that, this idea of the middle power, it's kind of an academic question. It's kind of something that, I think usually would be discussed on a kind of theoretical level. And when Lee and Marcos are sitting down in Manila, they're not going to be quite as interested in theoretical questions that might be of more interest to scholars or analysts. I think they're just going to be looking to find ways where there's overlapping interests that they can then present to their respective publics and say, here, I'm using foreign policy as a tool to address some kind of area of local need. And as Jean just laid out, there's a number of areas where the two countries can find overlapping interests. And so like one of those being, we do have two U.S. allies here, but as we all know, there's quite a bit of turmoil in the global sphere nowadays. The U.S. has made some indications that it is not going to play the customary role of a treaty ally necessarily. Might not be willing to come to the defenses of some of its Asian allies in quite the same way. So a country like the Philippines or a country like South Korea will be looking to make other plans, shall we say, just like looking into ways to bolster its own defenses and looking into ways where it would be able to ease its reliance on its traditional ally. And so, as we've said, as we've talked about on these airwaves before, South Korea has a lot of very nimble arms producers and is able to fill orders quickly and provide a lot of, kind of cost-effective and other desirable sorts of defense solutions to countries that are looking to bolster their own defenses. So that's an area of need. And but I would just say that South Korea and the Philippines have a cooperative relationship that goes back a long way. We can debate as to whether or not they both are middle powers, but they do kind of complement each other in a number of ways. And I think that when Lee and Marcos are discussing this, they're going to just be looking for practical areas where it makes sense for them to work together. And just to address the kind of more theoretical question a little more directly, I'm hearing echoes in my head of Mark Carney's recent speech at Davos when he said, the old kind of superpower-led international order is gone, and we should not lament it. Other countries should not be longing for that era and should not be putting too much faith in the kind of historic superpowers and should be looking for ways to cooperate on a middle power basis. And I think that's what we'll see in Manila this week.
Right, indeed. Prime Minister McCartney, he did say that nostalgia was not a strategy. Jean, you mentioned this earlier. What more can you tell us about the broader implications of partnership with South Korea for the Philippines?
Yeah, the Philippines is definitely looking for partnerships that offer greater certainty. I think because of the growing instability across the globe, certainty among partners is something that's becoming increasingly valuable. In a world where countries would issue red threats against their allies, was this the new currency? I don't foresee the Philippines going the isolationist route. Definitely, we have very liberal trade policies in order to encourage trading, and much of our defense posture is reliant on like-minded countries like South Korea to maintain regional peace and cooperation. As mentioned earlier, establishing diplomacy among middle power countries is very important. President Marcos has said that he wants to deepen ties with other countries such as Canada and India. To shift the focus more internally just a bit, to offer more of my insights, my country is currently trying to regain investor confidence following a massive corruption scandal in 2025. So foreign direct investments noticeably declined after the incident, and the admin is trying to win back both public trust and investor confidence. So I agree with Stephen that this might be an area of shared interest between the two countries. Data from our central bank show that South Korea is actually the leading source of foreign direct investments as of November 2025. So I think if done right, this meeting with President Lee can actually improve Manila's standing as an investment hub once again.
Right, hopefully. Stephen, this latest summit in the Philippines follows that in Singapore. How has President Lee Jae Myung's pragmatic diplomacy been serving his purpose of seeking partnership and stability with national interests at heart while navigating, of course, a very volatile geopolitical landscape?
Well, as Lee's term continues, it almost seems as when he took office in June of last year, like he was almost like able to see down the road a little bit, and he was able to see a kind of unraveling of some aspects of the, what is usually called the rules-based international order. That was already a pretty volatile time, and things have only gotten that much more volatile ever since then. And just given the current events, climates that we're living in, I think it only now seems that much more shrewd or that much more prudent that Lee would orient his foreign policy in the way that he has. And just for viewers who may not be familiar, like what we're referring to is Lee calling his foreign policy to be national interest based or pragmatic, or 실용주의, I think is the Korean word that he used to describe this. And so what that basically just meant was that he was not going to carry out foreign policy in adherence to any specific ideology. He was not going to pledge fealty to either China or the US. I mean, he didn't come out and say that specifically, but what he said was he was going to approach every international engagement, whether that be a bilateral encounter or a multilateral encounter, with South Korea's national interest in mind. And as I've said on before, I've been observing Lee on the job in his previous jobs and in his political candidacies for a long time. And something that I've always noticed about him and that I think he's carried over to his presidency is that he's quite skilled in giving constituents what they want. That's what he did when he was mayor of Seongnam. That's what he did when he was governor of Gyeonggi province. He was able to engage with a broad range of stakeholders and to make, kind of practical steps. And in Seongnam, he pioneered some universal basic income. In Gyeonggi province, he did a number of similar things. And I really just think he's brought that kind of mentality to the presidency. He's brought a mindset where he's telling the South Korean public that foreign policy is a tool for addressing basic national concerns. It is the international element of it, of engaging in an international forum, is kind of secondary, especially in this era where more and more countries are acting in kind of overt self-interest. So I think in times of international volatility, we see foreign policy being kind of burned down to its original intent, its kind of core intent, which, despite the lofty rhetoric about international cooperation to maintain order and peace and all that, really what foreign policy usually is countries looking for markets for their products, countries looking to ensure a safe international trade environment so that they can get what they want, import what they want, and export what they want. And for an export-led economy like South Korea, this all sounds very prudent. And I expect that when Lee returns from this trip and before he embarks on his next trip, his messaging will be quite heavy on this note. He will say, I am out here acting in the interests of the people who elected me. I am the president, 국민들이, the Korean word that doesn't translate perfectly, of the people who put him into power, the people who really run the country, that he ultimately answers to. And so I think this is a demonstration of that foreign policy vision. And I think it's one that suits the times quite well.
Right, indeed. Jean, what do you believe are some of the stories, follow-up stories that would be, that the media there in the Philippines will seek to cover in light of this latest summit between South Korea and the Philippines?
I think the Philippine media here is very keen to follow through on these agreements. Like, how will it transform into a tangible outcome? Will we see joint patrols between South Korea and the Philippines at the South China Sea? Or if there's a visiting forces agreement, what will this look like? The audiences here in the Philippines are very much more focused on concrete outcomes. So if we say that there's, for example, a new business agreement between South Korea and Philippines, the first question that Filipinos will ask is how will it help them? How will it help the common man? Or if it will generate more jobs for them. Personally, I'm very interested to follow up if the Philippines is able to do enough to win back investor confidence after this meeting with South Korea. And if all goes well, this could definitely be a benchmark or a signal for other nations that the Philippines is ready for business again.
Right, indeed. All right, Jean, I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for your time and thoughts over in Manila.
Thank you for having me.
And Stephen here in the studio as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
All right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for now. And do stay with Arirang News for continued coverage on the summit between South Korea and the Philippines.